My name is Alex Miller, 22 years old, and up until about 3 months ago, I considered myself a pretty regular guy. College student majoring in computer science, a decent enough GPA to keep my parents off my back, and a social life that consisted mostly of late-night coding sessions fueled by lukewarm coffee and the occasional pizza run with my buddies. I lived in an old house, a rental, off campus with 2 other guys, Mike, who was perpetually optimistic about everything, and Ben, who was perpetually cynical about everything. It was a classic setup, the kind of mundane existence you think will just continue. You never imagine the subtle cracks appearing in the plaster, the way the light starts to bend just a little wrong, until suddenly, everything you thought was solid shatters around you. It started innocently enough, like most things that eventually rip your life apart usually do. A sound. Just a sound. I was in my room, probably around 2 a.m., debugging some particularly stubborn piece of code for a project that was due the next morning. My headphones were on, a low hum of ambient electronic music helping me focus, but even through that, I heard it. A whisper. Or maybe it was more like a sigh. It was faint, barely there, like wind through a keyhole, but my room didn't have a draft. I pulled my headphones off, held my breath, and listened. Nothing. Just the hum of my desktop computer, the distant drone of traffic on the main road, and the gentle creaking of the old house settling. I shrugged it off. Old house, old pipes, old timbers, probably just a house talking to itself. I put my headphones back on, got back to work. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, I was just reading, winding down after a long day of lectures. No headphones, just the quiet of my room. It was clearer this time, distinct. A soft thud from downstairs, followed by that same sigh. It wasn't the kind of thud you get from a house settling or a branch hitting the roof. It sounded deliberate, like something heavy, but not quite solid, had landed on the floor. And the sigh? It was too human, too close to a breath exhaled in quiet exhaustion. My heart started a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. Mike and Ben were both out, probably at some party or another, so I was alone. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was overtired. But I got up, grabbed my phone for a flashlight, and slowly, quietly, made my way out of my room and to the top of the stairs. The house was dark, the only light coming from the streetlights filtering through the living room window downstairs. I strained my ears. Silence. Absolute, heavy silence. I went back to bed, feeling a bit foolish, but the prickle of unease had set in. It was like a tiny splinter, almost imperceptible, but always there, reminding you of its presence. The splinter became a sliver, then a shard. The subtle things started to pile up. Doors I swore I'd closed would be slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to catch your eye, to make you pause. The front door in particular. I was always meticulous about locking it, a habit drilled into me by my security-conscious dad. But more than once, I'd come downstairs in the morning to find it unlocked, sometimes even unlatched. I asked Mike and Ben about it. Mike just laughed. "Dude, you're probably just spacing out. We all do it." Ben, ever the skeptic, grumbled something about me being paranoid. I wanted to believe them, wanted to believe it was just my own forgetfulness, my own mind playing tricks. But a gut feeling, that primal, cold dread, told me otherwise.
Then came the cold. Not just a draft, but a distinct drop in temperature in certain areas of the house. Usually around a base of the stairs or in the hallway leading to the kitchen. It was like walking through a sudden, invisible cold spot, a pocket of air that felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. It would last only for a moment, then vanish. I mentioned it to Mike, who blamed the ancient insulation. Ben just shrugged, probably too busy dissecting the latest political scandal on his laptop. I started carrying a sweatshirt around the house, even in the middle of a surprisingly warm spring. It felt irrational, but the cold was real and it was unnerving. The dreams started then, vivid, unsettling, and always just out of reach upon waking. They weren't nightmares in the traditional sense, no monsters or chases. Instead, they were filled with mundane details, but with an underlying sense of wrongness. Rooms I knew, but subtly altered. Faces I recognized, but with vacant, unseeing eyes. And always that same sound from the house, the soft thud, the quiet sigh. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering, unable to shake the feeling that something had been with me in the dream, watching. It was like a static charge in the air, just before a thunderstorm. You can't see it, but you feel it, a tension that promises something powerful is about to break. One evening, I was alone again. Mike was at a concert, Ben visiting his family for the weekend. The house was unusually quiet, too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside seemed amplified, distorted. I was in the living room, trying to watch a movie, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting to the shadows, my ears straining for that sound. And then I heard it, clear as day. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. My stomach dropped. I knew for a fact both Mike and Ben were gone. My blood ran cold. The footsteps weren't heavy, not like a person walking normally. They were light, almost hesitant, like someone padding barefoot across the floorboards. One step, pause. Another step, pause. They seemed to be coming from Mike's room, then Ben's, then the hallway. It sounded like someone was exploring. I sat there frozen on the couch, my phone clutched in my sweaty hand. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt, to run out the front door and not look back. But something else, a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to rationalize, kept me rooted. My mind raced, trying to conjure any logical explanation. Maybe one of them had come back early? No, they would have called out, slammed the door. A squirrel in the attic? This wasn't the scuttling of a rodent. These were distinct, human-like steps. My breath hitched in my throat as the steps paused directly above me, in the hallway that connected our 3 bedrooms. I could almost feel a presence, a weight in the air just above my head. Then the steps started again, slowly descending the main staircase. Each creak of the old wood was a hammer blow to my chest. I could hear it getting closer, steadily, deliberately. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as dust. I stared at the staircase, shrouded in shadows. I could barely make out the banister, the outlines of the steps. The steps stopped. They stopped on the bottom landing, just out of my sight. The air in the room grew instantly colder, the temperature plummeting so rapidly I could see my own breath fogging slightly in front of me. I felt a pressure, a crushing weight, as if something immense was standing just inches away, radiating an icy dread that seeped into my bones. And then, in the suffocating silence, I heard it again, that sigh. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was right there, incredibly close, a soft, wet exhalation that seemed to come from directly in front of me, in the dark space where the stairs met the living room. It was like someone had just breathed out, right onto my face. The smell of dust and something metallic, something like old, dried blood, hit me. I could feel the hairs on my arm stand on end, a prickling sensation that crawled up my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the darkness, waiting for something to emerge. My mind screamed at me to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped, a silent witness to whatever horror was lurking just beyond my sight.
The silence stretched, unbearable, heavy with an unseen presence. And then a whisper, so low I almost missed it, seemed to brush against my ear, just on the edge of hearing, like a secret meant only for me. It was too soft to make out words, just a breathy, drawn-out sound, a lingering exhale that seemed to promise a terror I couldn't yet comprehend. The whisper, or whatever it was, faded, leaving me in a vacuum of silence that felt even more oppressive than the sounds that had preceded it. My breath, which I hadn't realized I was holding, burst out of me in a shaky gasp. My heart was still hammering, but a new sensation was creeping in, a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It was as if every ounce of my energy had been siphoned away by the sheer terror of that moment. I didn't dare move, didn't dare even blink for what felt like an eternity. My eyes were still fixed on the bottom of the stairs, convinced that something was going to materialize, some formless horror from the shadows. But nothing did. Only the heavy, cold silence remained. Slowly, agonizingly, the extreme chill in the air began to recede, replaced by the normal, slightly cool temperature of the house. The pressure I had felt, that crushing weight, eased. It was like a tangible presence was retreating, withdrawing back into the fabric of the old house. I waited for another 5 minutes, maybe 10, before I finally dared to move. My limbs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. I stumbled to my feet, my legs wobbly, and fumbled for the light switch on the wall. The sudden flood of artificial light was jarring, harsh, but utterly welcome. It banished the deep shadows, revealing the mundane reality of the living room. The worn couch, the stack of textbooks on the coffee table, the faded rug. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing physical at least, but the feeling, that lingering residue of dread, clung to the air like a phantom scent.
I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I stayed in the living room, lights on, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, jumping at every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows. The sun finally rose, painting the sky in pale pastels, and with the light came a fragile sense of normalcy. When Mike finally got back late that morning, bleary-eyed and smelling faintly of stale beer, I tried to tell him what happened. I really did. But as the words came out, they sounded ridiculous, flimsy. Footsteps, a cold spot, a whisper. Even to my own ears, it sounded like the ramblings of someone who'd had too much caffeine and too little sleep. Mike just patted my shoulder. "Rough night, huh, dude? Go get some shut-eye. You're seeing things." He meant well, but his dismissal only deepened my isolation. How could I explain something that defied all logic? Something that my own senses were screaming at me was real, when no one else could perceive it. The incidents didn't stop. They intensified, growing bolder, more intrusive. The doors I'd closed would now be wide open. Objects would be moved. My headphones, which I always left on my desk, would be on my bed. My textbooks, carefully stacked, would be strewn across the floor. Small, unsettling acts that chipped away at my sanity. I started to question everything. Was I truly losing my mind? Was the stress of college finally getting to me? I tried to find patterns, to rationalize. Maybe Ben was playing pranks. But Ben wasn't the type for elaborate silent jokes. He preferred sarcasm and direct insults. And he looked as bewildered as I did when I found my laptop charger unplugged and neatly coiled in the middle of my room, something I never did. The cold spots became more frequent, and they lingered longer. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and it would feel like I'd stepped into a freezer. My breath would fog, and a shiver would rack my body that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. I started to carry a small thermometer with me just to confirm I wasn't imagining it.
And sure enough, in those cold pockets, the temperature would drop significantly, sometimes by 15 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit, before slowly climbing back to normal. It was undeniable proof, at least to me, that something unnatural was happening. But what? Then the whispers started to solidify, to become actual fragmented words. They were always just at the edge of hearing, like a radio station barely tuned in. Get out. Alone. Mine. They were always accompanied by that chilling sigh, that pervasive sense of an unseen presence. They were never loud, never distinct enough to be clearly understood, but the intent was clear, malevolent. It was like a slow, psychological torture. I stopped sleeping in my room, opting for the couch in the living room with all the lights on, a cheap plastic cross I'd bought online clutched in my hand. Mike and Ben thought I was studying late, pulling all-nighters. I let them believe it. One afternoon, I was home alone, trying to work on a paper. I was in my room, headphones on, music blasting, trying to drown out the silence, trying to drown out the growing paranoia. Suddenly, my music cut out. The computer screen flickered, then went black. I sighed, assuming a power surge or a tripped breaker. But then, a high-pitched whine started, coming from the speakers, slowly rising in intensity. A piercing, agonizing sound that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't static. It was something else, something unnatural, like a tormented scream stretched thin. I ripped my headphones off, my hands clamped over my ears, but the sound was still there, vibrating through the room, through the floorboards, through the very air. It was physically painful, a pure assault on my senses. I stopped sleeping in my room, opting for the couch in the living room with all the lights on, a cheap plastic cross I'd bought online clutched in my hand. Mike and Ben thought I was studying late, pulling all-nighters. I let them believe it. One afternoon, I was home alone trying to work on a paper. I was in my room, headphones on, music blasting, trying to drown out the silence, trying to drown out the growing paranoia. Suddenly, my music cut out. The computer screen flickered, then went black. I sighed, assuming a power surge or a tripped breaker. But then, a high-pitched whine started, coming from the speakers, slowly rising in intensity, a piercing, agonizing sound that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't static. It was something else, something unnatural, like a tormented scream stretched thin. I ripped my headphones off, my hands clamped over my ears, but the sound was still there, vibrating through the room, through the floorboards, through the very air. It was physically painful, a pure assault on my senses. And then, through the agonizing whine, I heard it, clear as a bell, right next to my ear, a deep, resonant voice, guttural and ancient, whispered a single word: welcome. The whine cut off abruptly. The computer screen flickered back to life, music resuming as if nothing had happened. I sat there, trembling, paralyzed by a terror so profound it stole my breath. The voice wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a sigh. It was a declaration, a welcoming. To what? To the nightmare my life had become? I could feel its presence now, thick and oppressive, filling the room, pushing down on me. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for a long time. And whatever it was no longer content to just play games. It wanted me to know it was here. It wanted me to know I was its. I scrambled out of my chair, my legs shaking so violently I nearly fell. I burst out of my room, needing to escape, needing air, needing anything that felt real and safe. I ran downstairs, past the living room and out the front door, not even bothering to grab my keys or my wallet. I just ran.
I ran down the street, my lungs burning, not caring where I was going, just needing to be as far away from that house as possible. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, leaning against a lamppost, gasping for air, tears streaming down my face. The sun was still shining. People were walking their dogs, cars were driving by, their occupants oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded. Everything looked normal, but I knew with a chilling certainty that nothing would ever be normal for me again. The game was over. It had announced itself, and I had been welcomed. I spent the next few days in a haze. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the house, not even to grab my laptop or a change of clothes. I crashed on Mike's cousin's couch, making up some vague excuse about a plumbing issue at the rental. I knew it sounded thin, but I was beyond caring. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, haunted by the memory of that ancient, resonant voice. Every shadow seemed to twist into something menacing. Every creak of the unfamiliar house made me jump. My phone was a constant source of anxiety, as Mike and Ben texted, asking where I was, what was going on. I ignored most of their calls, my mind a tangled mess of fear and confusion. But I couldn't stay away forever. My classes, my assignments, my entire life was back at that house. And despite the terror, a strange, desperate need for answers had begun to gnaw at me. What was happening? Why me? What did it want? The unknown was almost as terrifying as the known. So, after 3 sleepless nights, I finally mustered the courage. I called Mike, told him I was coming back, that the plumbing issue was sorted. He sounded relieved. I felt nothing but a cold dread coiling in my stomach. Walking back up the familiar pathway to the house felt like walking into a trap. The sunlight, usually so comforting, seemed to mock me, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with my imagination. I pushed open the front door, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys. The house was quiet. Too quiet. That oppressive silence, the one that screamed of an unseen presence, immediately wrapped around me. I could feel its eyes on me, a heavy, suffocating gaze that followed my every move. It was no longer subtle. It was blatant. I tried to act normal. I went to my room, trying to force myself to unpack, to pretend everything was fine. But my hands trembled, and my eyes darted constantly to the corners of the room, to the closet door, to the space under my bed. I pulled out my laptop, but the screen seemed to glow with an unhealthy light, and I couldn't bring myself to touch the keyboard. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to run, but where? How far could I run from something that felt like it was attached to the very foundations of the house, perhaps even to me?
Then the scratching started. It came from inside the walls of my room, a light, rhythmic scratching, like long fingernails dragging against plaster. It started small, almost imperceptible, then grew steadily louder, more frantic. It sounded like something was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps to get in. I pounded on the wall, yelling, "Stop it! What do you want?" The scratching immediately ceased. Silence. I leaned my head against the cool wall, panting, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. A few minutes later, it started again, this time from the attic access panel in the hallway just outside my room. A scuttling, slithering sound, followed by a soft thud, then the distinct squeak of old floorboards. It was moving. It was moving above me. I heard it crawl across the attic, directly over my head. Then, pause. A chilling stillness descended, heavy and suffocating. And then, from directly above my ceiling, came a series of rapid, deliberate knocks. 1, 2, 3. They weren't loud, but they resonated through the house, through my bones. They were like a message, a dark communication. I ran out of my room, almost colliding with Mike, who was coming out of the bathroom. He looked at me concerned. "Dude, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something's in the attic," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I heard it. Knocks." Mike, ever the rational one, sighed. "Probably just a squirrel, Alex, or the wind. This old place makes all kinds of noises." He tried to smile reassuringly, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He'd heard the odd creaks, felt the occasional cold spot. He just hadn't experienced the full, unfiltered horror. That night, things escalated beyond subtle hints and psychological torment. I was trying to sleep, huddled under my covers in my bed, a lamp left on, when I felt it. A cold pressure on my ankle. It was light at first, like a feather brushing against my skin, but then it tightened, like a cold, skeletal hand had wrapped around my leg. I gasped, pulling my leg away instantly, scrambling back against the headboard. My eyes darted to the foot of my bed. Nothing, just the crumpled sheets. But then, the covers at the foot of my bed began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they began to slide down, as if being pulled by an invisible force. My breath hitched in my throat. I could see the indentation on the mattress, the subtle shift of the springs, as if something heavy was sitting there. The covers continued to slide, revealing my feet, then my shins, slowly, agonizingly, until my legs were completely exposed to the cold, empty air. My skin crawled. I felt a brush of something cold against my exposed ankle again, a pressure that was undeniable, like it was testing me. I closed my eyes tightly, forcing myself to breathe, trying to convince myself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation. But when I opened them again, the covers were still pulled down, my legs still exposed, and the pressure on my ankle was back, firmer now, almost a grip. It was cold, so intensely cold it felt like ice against my skin, and the grip felt impossibly thin, like skeletal fingers. A shiver tore through me, not from cold, but from sheer terror. I could feel its presence now, heavy and suffocating, sitting at the foot of my bed, its icy touch on my skin. I could almost hear its ragged breath close to my face, though I know that was just my mind playing tricks. And then a new sound, a low, guttural growl emanating not from the foot of the bed, but from directly beneath it. It was a sound of immense displeasure, of ancient hunger. The growl vibrated through the floorboards, through the very mattress beneath me. It was a sound that belonged to something primordial, something that had been waiting, lurking, for a very long time. The grip on my ankle tightened, digging in, and a sharp, piercing pain shot up my leg. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was actively hurting me. I could feel the individual pressure points, the faint, unnerving sensation of long, sharp nails. My scream tore through the silence of the house, raw and desperate. I scrambled off the bed, stumbling backwards, pulling my leg free with a violent jerk. I scrambled for the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't care about Mike or Ben, about my laptop, about my clothes. I just needed to get out. I burst out of my room, slamming the door shut behind me, not bothering to look back. I ran down the stairs, tripping once, almost falling, my vision blurred by tears of pure, unadulterated fear. The front door was suddenly a beacon of hope, the only escape. I threw it open, gasping for breath, and stumbled out into the cool night air. I looked back at the house, bathed in the sickly glow of the streetlights. The old windows seemed like vacant black eyes, staring back at me,
filled with an ancient malevolence. And in one of the upstairs windows, the one to my room, I saw it. Just a fleeting glimpse. A pale, distorted face, barely visible in the darkness, pressed against the glass, watching me. Its eyes were black, bottomless pits, and a wide, unnatural smile stretched across its mouth. And then it was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. I stood on the sidewalk, trembling, unable to move, unable to breathe, my gaze fixed on that window. The house stood silent, dark, a menacing silhouette against the pale night sky. It had finally shown itself, or a part of itself at least, and I knew with a horrifying certainty that this was only the beginning. The welcome it had given me was not an invitation, but a declaration of ownership, and I had no idea how to escape. The image of that face pressed against my bedroom window branded itself onto my mind. It was a silent, terrifying confirmation that everything I had experienced was real, and that whatever was in that house, it was watching me. It knew me, and it was no longer content to simply haunt. I didn't go back inside that night, not for hours. I walked aimlessly through the quiet suburban streets, the fear a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I called my parents, but the words caught in my throat. How do you explain a face in a window, an icy grip on your ankle, a guttural growl from under your bed, without sounding completely unhinged? I ended up just telling them I was stressed with exams and needed a walk to clear my head. They seemed to buy it, but their concern was palpable even over the phone. When I finally, reluctantly returned to the house, it was dawn. The first tentative rays of sunlight were painting the sky, and the world was beginning to stir. Mike was already awake, making coffee, looking rumpled. He didn't ask where I'd been. He just looked at me, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a quiet worry. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice low. I just nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight. I went straight to my room, feeling a fresh wave of dread as I approached the door. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, half expecting to see that face again, to hear that growl. But the room was still, bathed in the pale morning light. My covers were still pulled down at the foot of the bed, exactly where I'd left them. The sight sent a fresh shiver down my spine. It hadn't been a dream. It had been real. I knew I couldn't stay there. Not anymore. The house was no longer just an old rental. It was a prison, and I was its captive audience. I started making plans, frantic and desperate. I'd finish the semester online, claim a family emergency, anything to get out. I started packing immediately, throwing clothes into a duffel bag with a feverish intensity. Mike came to check on me, seeing my frantic packing. "Alex, what's going on? Are you leaving?" he asked, his voice genuinely concerned now. I turned to him, the words tumbling out of me in a rush, a torrent of fear and explanation. I told him everything. The whispers, the cold spots, the moving objects, the growl, the face in the window. I expected him to laugh, to dismiss me, but he didn't. He just listened, his face growing paler and paler with each revelation. When I finished, the room was silent. "Alex," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what to say. I thought you were just stressed, but the cold spots and the doors, I've noticed them too. I just dismissed it, blamed myself." He ran a hand through his hair, looking utterly shaken. "Ben's noticed stuff too. He just says the house is weird. He thinks it's just the age of the place." His admission, his belief, was a small comfort, a tiny crack in the wall of my isolation. But it didn't lessen the fear. If anything, it solidified the reality of what we were dealing with. That night, for the first time,
Mike and Ben decided to stay in the living room with me. We turned on all the lights, watched movies, tried to act normal. But every shadow seemed to deepen. Every creak seemed to hold a malicious intent. We didn't talk about it much, but the shared silence, the unspoken understanding, was heavy. Around 3 a.m., just when the house usually felt the most alive, it started. Not the subtle stuff. This was different. A low, rhythmic knocking began from somewhere deep within the walls of the house. It wasn't in one specific place. It seemed to resonate from everywhere at once. A hollow, echoing thud that vibrated through the floorboards and up into our seats. It grew louder, faster, like a heartbeat, building to a frantic crescendo. The lights in the living room flickered, then dimmed, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Then, from upstairs, we heard it. Not footsteps this time, but a heavy, dragging sound, like something immense being pulled across the old wooden floors. It was slow, agonizingly slow, moving from one end of the house to the other, then back again. A deep, raspy whisper began to fill the air, not directed at any one of us, but permeating the entire space. A low, constant murmur that seemed to coil around our minds, pressing in. We couldn't make out words, but the sound itself was pure malevolence. Suddenly, the front door, which we had meticulously locked, burst open with a violent bang, slamming against the wall. A blast of icy wind tore through the house, even though the windows were closed. The sheer force of it extinguished the remaining lights, plunging us into absolute darkness. We huddled together on the couch, 3 young men, terrified beyond anything we had ever known. The cold was unbearable, a bone-chilling frost that seeped into our clothes, into our skin. The dragging sound upstairs intensified, now punctuated by guttural growls and choked, gasping breaths that seemed to echo from the very walls. The whispers were no longer just in the air. They were in our ears, surrounding us, a cacophony of sound that seemed to be closing in. Suddenly, the front door, which we had meticulously locked, burst open with a violent bang, slamming against the wall. A blast of icy wind tore through the house, even though the windows were closed. The sheer force of it extinguished the remaining lights, plunging us into absolute darkness. We huddled together on the couch, 3 young men, terrified beyond anything we had ever known. The cold was unbearable, a bone-chilling frost that seeped into our clothes, into our skin. The dragging sound upstairs intensified, now punctuated by guttural growls and choked, gasping breaths that seemed to echo from the very walls. The whispers were no longer just in the air. They were in our ears, surrounding us, a cacophony of sound that seemed to be closing in. And then, from the blackness at the foot of the stairs, directly where I had heard it that first night, a new sound emerged, a wet, tearing sound, followed by a sickening crunch, like bone breaking. And with it, an unbearable stench filled the air, a foul, cloying odor of decay, of something ancient and dead, yet horribly alive. We heard the heavy, dragging sound begin to descend the stairs, slowly, deliberately. Each thudding step accompanied by that wet, tearing noise and the stench that made us gag. It was coming for us. We knew it. We just didn't know what it was. Mike, bless his brave but foolish heart, fumbled for his phone, trying to turn on the flashlight. But just as he did, a low, resonant growl, the same one I'd heard under my bed, filled the room. So close, it felt like it was inside us. And then his phone, clutched in his hand, seemed to shatter internally, sparking violently, before going completely dark. The dragging sound stopped on the bottom step, just out of sight in the darkness. The air around us became so cold it burned, and the stench was overwhelming. We could feel its presence now, immense and suffocating, directly in front of us, emanating an unimaginable malevolence. A single, soft sigh filled the darkness, closer than anything I had ever heard. It was not a sound of exhaustion, but of profound satisfaction. And then a whisper, clear and distinct, seemed to brush against my ear, its icy breath caressing my skin. "You're home now." The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any sound. We sat there, paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. The cold was still there, but it felt different now. No longer just a temperature drop, but a living, breathing entity. We knew it was still with us, waiting, watching. And we knew, with a horrifying certainty that twisted our very souls, that we were never leaving this house. Not really. Not ever. The house had welcomed us, and it had finally claimed its prize.